Haja, in your mind, what is the most pain a human being can endure?
That's a difficult one.
And maybe my question is not clear. I mean, can you, for instance, imagine someone walking barefoot through the hot Sahara Desert for more than 3 days with almost no water?
Yeah, I see what you mean. There is something deeply unsettling about the kinds of hardships people become willing to endure for someone they love, right?
Yeah. And yeah, I also see that this aspect of today's book touched you deeply.
Yep, I did indeed.
And I think it makes sense, right? Because at some point, the story of this book stops feeling distant. You stop seeing a migrant story and start seeing a human being pushed far beyond what any person should have to endure.
Welcome to Threads of Ifriqiya, a space where African voices, books, and ideas come alive. Each episode, we open the pages of books, narrations, and oral traditions that carry the rhythms, struggles, and dreams of the continent. I'm Hajar,
And I'm Ramdan.
and together we're weaving a richer understanding of Africa, one thread at a time.
Today's book is titled Little Brother. It's a powerful collaboration between two different voices coming together to tell a single story, a single lived experience. On one side, there is Ibrahima Balde, who is a Guinean refugee living in the Basque country. And he does not write in the traditional sense. Instead, he carries the memory of his journey, the raw testimony of what he lived through while traveling from Guinea all the way to Libya, crossing the burning and unforgiving Sahara Desert in search of his little brother, who himself had left on a migratory journey. And on the other side, there is Amets Arzallus Antia, who is a traditional Basque bard and writer, and he gives form to Ibrahima's spoken story. He listens, translates, and shapes the narrative without ever taking ownership of it. So this book is not simply written by one person. It's created through a shared act of what I would call transmission between Ibrahima's voice and Ahmed's hand.
Yeah, or co-created, to be
Exactly.
more precise. Yeah.
Yeah. So the story told in this book is so powerful, I believe. It's the kind of story that can fundamentally change the way you look at migrants, the people you may casually see wandering through your city, serving you coffee at a restaurant, or quietly cleaning your office building every morning. This could very well be the story of any one of them, or maybe not, because this story is also in some way deeply unique. So the book is autobiographical. It tells, as I said, the story of Ibrahima Balde's life. And one thing I can already tell you is that Ibrahima went through immense suffering. Now, before we delve into the story itself, what makes this episode a little different for us is that both of us actually read the book beforehand. Different in the sense that one of us usually reads the book and narrates the story, while the other only reads it afterward if the discussion sparks enough curiosity. But this time we both read the book before recording the episode. And because of that, our readings of the book may differ quite a bit, shaped by our own experiences and context. So, Haja, is there something else you want to add?
Sure. I would like to mention, most importantly, that Little Brother was a recommendation of our dear friends, Alpha and his wife Adeline, who follow the podcast and actually lent us this book to review. So our heartfelt thanks
to read.
To read and review. Our heartfelt thanks to Adeline and Alpha for their support. Additionally, Alpha shared with us his reading of the book, which we'll be playing throughout the episode.
Yeah, exactly. I see. I was saying to read because usually we read books and it doesn't necessarily make it into the podcast.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we were convinced by this one.
Exactly. Yeah.
And for me, this book immediately reminded me of, I would say, my professional world. My day job is in the international development sector, and more specifically working at the intersection of private sector or business development and social impact. So specifically, I focus on many of the countries that were cited in this book. And some people refer to those countries as fragile countries. So while reading the book, beyond the deeply emotional aspects of the story, I kept asking myself broader structural questions, such as how are conditions that sometimes resemble what we can call modern slavery is still possible today. I think someone, for instance, working in humanitarian aid or development aid might approach the book differently, perhaps from a more immediate emotional or relief centered perspective. But mine was more about structural questions. How did we get to that point?
Yeah.
So, Haja, I don't know, what was your reading of the book coming from a purely business perspective?
Yeah, I don't think there is any business perspective to this book, in my opinion. I mean, before or beyond what I would describe as the dark side of capitalism.
Mhm.
Basically using the logic of capitalism to subjugate people,
Yeah.
or rather the other way around, but yeah, whatever. So, because what we see in the book is people literally trading in and making money off other people's misery and distress, what you effectively call quote unquote modern slavery.
Yeah, I said modern slavery, although this is not a very diplomatic term to use. Some people don't like it,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. But to be fair, I think it's accurate. But yeah, it's incredible to which lengths some humans might go to make an extra buck, even if I try to understand, as you said, like think about the structural background, etc. So I tried to think where this came from. I couldn't find any empathy for those people. Living in the harsh conditions and the brutal scarcity of the Sahara Desert does not necessarily justify becoming a monster. The other side of the coin is the complicity of the European Union and its governments in one of the most, or one of the worst human tragedies in our century, which is unfortunately not talked about enough. And you'd understand why as we go through the story of the book. And yeah, back to the European Union, although they are aware of the abuses happening to migrants from Africa along the way, they are putting all of the resources to keep them locked in this cruel and lawless trap. And in any case, listeners will understand more about what I'm alluding to with regards to the migrant journey as we tell more about Ibrahima's perilous, crossing of the desert.
Yeah, and I was about to say that you're going into the details already, although right now it might feel a little bit abstract for the listeners. Now, with that being said, there won't be an about the author section in this episode because the entire book is, as we said, about the author's life. So instead, what we will do is follow the story as it unfolds, while also reflecting on some of the recurring themes and broader questions that emerge from Ibrahima's journey.
Yeah, so we're not structuring the episode also as we usually do around themes, but it's going to be around the story itself.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, let's jump straight into the story. Ibrahima Balde was born into a family of 6 children. One brother called Al Hassan, and keep that name in mind because, as the title suggests, the story ultimately revolves around him
Yeah.
and two younger sisters. He spent his early childhood in Conakry, and Conakry is the capital city of Guinea, living with his father who suffered from diabetes and ran a very small informal sector business selling shoes. The business provided just enough for the family to survive, but not enough to properly cover the healthcare needs of a chronically ill father.
Yeah. So, just for context, Ibrahima lived with his father in the capital while his family, basically his brother and two sisters and mom, lived in the village, back in the village, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And keep this detail in mind because later in the episode, I want to come back to it and connect it to some broader ideas about why many African countries continue to struggle with development. Sometimes when we speak about underdevelopment, we imagine abstract economic indicators or government policies. But here you already see what that reality looks like concretely. One illness, one fragile income source, and an entire family living permanently on the edge of collapse.
Yeah.
From the age of 5 until 13, Ibrahima lived mainly with his father. And then one morning he woke up and realized his father was not moving, not waking up. He tried to shake him, call him, move him, but his body was cold, frozen almost. His eyes were wide open and motionless. Remember, Ibrahima is only 13 years old, so he did not immediately understand what he was seeing. He did not yet understand that his father was dead. And in many ways, I would say this is where Ibrahima's struggle truly begins. After his father's death, the neighbors gathered mourning together so he could travel back to his village and reunite with his mom and siblings. And with that journey came another brutal reality. Ibrahima had to leave school. His mother then sold two of the family's cows and gave him the money so he could start something, quote unquote. And by something, she simply meant find a way to make money, survive, and take care of us. 13 years old.
Yeah.
By the way, do you have a sense of how significant cows are in Pula society?
Yeah. And maybe we need to explain first what the Pular society means.
Yeah.
So, Pular actually is a language, but people usually use it to refer to the ethnic group behind it, who speaks it. And the ethnic group is officially called Fulani or Fula, and in French, for example, it's called Peul. And interestingly, I came across it the first time when you told me about your master thesis research, right?
Yeah.
Which is around the Fulani communities in northern Benin and their important role in ecosystem conservation, especially in the efforts against climate change. Anyways, without getting too nerdy here, Fulani is an ethnic group which is widely dispersed across Western Africa and the Sahel region. So which goes up to Sudan and Ethiopia in the east and the south of Algeria in the north, and of course all of Western Africa. And this is mainly because they used to be historically nomadic people who lived out.
Pastoralist.
Exactly, that's the technical word, pastoralists, who lived out from the cow herds they owned. And back to your question, that explains about the importance of the cow in the Fulani society, since cows are basically equivalent to family assets or estate in economic term. So the equivalent in my culture, for example, would be to sell your inherited olive tree farm.
Exactly. So that's exactly what I was looking for to kind of describe the importance of the cows and what it meant for them selling two cows. So at just 13 years old, Ibrahima suddenly became someone expected to contribute financially to the survival of the household, helping his already weakened and sick mother support the rest of the family. Now, let me pause here for a second and offer two readings of what's happening. My first reading here is that a large part of the burden Ibrahima carries throughout the rest of the story, as you will see, the pressure that pushes him to take unimaginable risk comes from this very specific responsibility placed on the eldest child in many African families. And I think this is one of those things that can be difficult to fully understand from a Western perspective.
Yep.
Because in many African households, the eldest son is not just a child. Very early on, he becomes a second parent, a provider, sometimes even the emotional backbone of the family. Once the father dies, that responsibility doesn't disappear. It simply falls onto the eldest son or
Mm.
daughter. So when we later see Ibrahima crossing deserts, enduring violence, risking death again and again, yes, part of it is poverty, part of it is circumstance, but part of it is also deeply internalized sense of duty. This belief that he must carry the family somehow, no matter the cost. And whether that expectation is fair or unfair is, I think, another discussion entirely.
Yeah. And just beyond the discussion about fairness, I was thinking that the sense of duty has trumped the logic or rationality for Ibrahima. Um,
Mm,
we will see as we go further into the book, but my first thought about his attempt to save his brother later in the story is that this is almost mission impossible.
mm.
The probability of success was so low that it wasn't even worth it. Yet Ibrahima made the move in order not to face the reproaching looks of his mother. This also reminds me of the discussion we had around African parenting in our previous episode about Jacaranda.
Mm.
A lot of unsaid and a lot of tacit expectations between parent and child.
Well, I don't think I necessarily agree with this.
You don't agree that it's mission impossible to find
No,
his
like
brother?
I don't agree with saying that it's not rational for Ibrahima
Okay.
to do this because we said there is a sense of duty.
Yeah.
Yes, it's instilled by parents,
Yeah.
but it stops there.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily hold you accountable for anything that you don't do.
Yeah.
But because it has been socially or psychologically engineered
Yeah.
from the day your younger siblings are born,
Yeah.
you end up not being able to imagine that you cannot
You cannot save them.
save them.
Yeah.
So for him, what he was doing was totally rational. He was doing the right thing, not
Yeah.
for his mom, but because that was the thing to do.
Yeah.
But I also understand what you mean. It might not feel rational
An external
from an
perspective.
external perspective. But I think there is perhaps this sense of duty in also old money families in Europe or the US or very conservative
Yeah.
families. It's not necessarily going in the crossing the desert, but
Yeah.
maybe making sure that the family business doesn't go bankrupt.
Yeah. I see. Yeah, I see your point. Yeah.
And interestingly, Alpha made a very similar observation in his contribution to this episode. And just so our listeners know, we simply asked him to share his thoughts on the book without giving him any guidance on the themes he should discuss. Yet, independently, he picked up on the very same idea. I mean, this overwhelming sense of duty in African families and the sacrifices it can push people to make. So let's hear what Afa had to say.
When I started reading Little Brother, I thought I was going to read a story about migration, but very quickly it became something much more personal for me. I'm from Guinea-Bissau, from the village of Cambore, and while reading Ibrahima Balde's story, I kept thinking about how easily my life could have followed a completely different path. I was fortunate enough to come to Europe with my parents when I was still young, after being born in the village and growing up there. I didn't have to cross the desert, I didn't have to disappear into the migration route, and I didn't have to survive prison or the smugglers. But this book made me realize how thin that line really is. Reading it felt like looking into an alternative timeline, a version of my own life that could have happened under slightly different circumstances. The first part of the book really stays with me because it begins with responsibility. After Ibrahima's father dies, he suddenly becomes the man of the family. That pressure shapes everything he does. He leaves home to go to work, to survive, to support the people around him. And what struck me is that the story doesn't begin with some dream of Europe. It begins with a sense of duty, which is very prominent in West Africa. That's very important because so many conversations about migration in Europe reduces people to statistics or politics. But in this book, migration starts with family, with obligation, with trying to take care of younger siblings. That felt deeply familiar to me culturally, even if my own path was different. Then comes one of the emotional turning point of the book. His younger brother Al Hassan leaves for Libya without really understanding the dangers ahead. And that is also despite the fact that Ibrahima warned him not to take that road. And from that moment, the entire story changes. Ibrahima isn't chasing for Europe for himself, he's chasing his brother. He's trying to bring him back alive as he promised to his mother. I think that changes how we read the whole journey. This isn't an adventure story, it's a rescue mission. And as you turn the page, you closely get drawn into that unfolding tragedy that you already know how it will end when you start the book. And while reading that section, I kept imagining my own family. What would my parent have done if one of us disappeared into those migration routes? What would I have done if my younger brother had left for Europe? The book forces you to ask very uncomfortable questions because suddenly migration stops feeling distant. It becomes personal.
So, Haja, you see, it felt familiar to me and also to Alpha, this sense of duty and, as he put it, a rescue mission. And also something he noted was that, he knew nothing about migration. It's not like there is a crash course that you can take. What's waiting for you in the migration route.
Yeah. It's a journey into the unknown, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
that's
he
right.
could
I understand.
not imagine that he was doing something irrational.
Yeah. Now that makes sense.
So now my second reading is that this is exactly where the vicious cycle of underdevelopment I was referring to earlier begins to take shape in front of us. See, a family lacks access to proper healthcare. So the father dies from a chronic illness. Normally people don't die
from diabetes, right?
diabetes in developed countries.
Yeah.
And the death pushes the households deeper into poverty.
Yeah, because there is no safety net, basically.
Yes,
no
exactly.
insurances, nothing.
No healthcare even.
Yeah.
The child then drops out of school to work. And once education disappears, social mobility often disappears with it. Poverty reproduces itself across generations almost mechanically. And remember, this is not fiction. This is a true story, and it is just the beginning, as you see.
And regarding the vicious circle of poverty, I think economists call it the poverty trap, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, back to the story. And by the way, I'm really only giving you the major milestones here. The details, the small moments, the emotions, the encounters along the way. Those are absolutely worth reading in the book itself. So, still very young, Ibrahima travels again alone, this time for Liberia. So, first we said he went to his mom and siblings in the village, and 2 cows were sold, money was given to him, he had to do something. So now he decides to go to Liberia at 13 years old.
Yeah. So now his brother hasn't left yet, just to situate ourselves in the story.
Oh, yeah. So he travels for 3 long days on top of a bus, squeezed between luggage and suitcases. Eventually, he arrives in Monrovia, the capital city of Liberia. There, he starts surviving however he can. At first, he works in a market carrying people's goods, sometimes loads probably heavier than he was himself.
Yeah.
And
He's
later,
a child, right?
yeah, 13 years old. And after that, a Guinean truck driver in Monrovia takes pity on him and offers him work as an apprentice. So Ibrahima works for the man and lives with him for a while. Then one day, about 6 months in Liberia, he calls his family back home. And during that call, his younger brother, Al Hassan, tells him that their mother is seriously ill. Again, healthcare. Al Hassan, the brother, tells him, if you can, come back home. And Ibrahima simply replies, okay. By the way, he loves to reply by just saying okay in the book.
And funnily, it's written OKE. So it's like the simplest form of okay.
So you see, he started, if you want, a small economic activity, and because of health issues, he had to stop that again.
Yeah.
And go back and take care of his mom. So he goes back to the village. Once he arrives in the village, this 13 or maybe 14 by now year old boy carries his sick mother on his back for more than 9 kilometers, I believe, to reach a hospital. And just pause for a second and imagine that image.
Yeah.
A teenager carrying his mother for kilometers because there is simply no other option.
Yeah. Which means no hospital which is nearby, nor transportation.
Exactly. And thankfully, his mother recovers. And for the next 2 years, Ibrahima stays with the family, taking care of the household responsibilities so that his younger siblings can continue to go to school. And here again, you see this pattern repeating itself throughout the book. Ibrahima constantly sacrificing his own future so that others around him can still have one.
Yeah.
But eventually, at 16, he decides to leave once more. This time, returning to Conakry, the capital city of Guinea, hoping to earn enough money to support his younger brother Al Hassan, who, according to him, had the abilities to succeed in school. So Ibrahima goes back to Conakry, where he spends about 4 years working as an apprentice for a truck driver. And then comes yet another phone call from home. This time, the family tells him that his younger brother Al Hassan is missing. Several months later, they finally received news from him, Al Hassan, that the younger brother had migrated to Libya. Eventually, Ibrahima manages to speak to his brother on the phone. And honestly, for me, this was one of the most touching moments in the entire book. And that says a lot because this book is filled with moments so painful and human that at times you almost cry. So let me attempt to recount the conversation, although it's difficult to fully convey what it felt like reading it. Ibrahima asked his brother, uh, little brother, and they have a word for little brother in the book. So, little brother, what have you gone to look for in Libya? And Al Hassan replies, I wanted to go to Europe. Then Ibrahima says, and you were going to go to Europe without saying anything to me. And the little brother answers, forgive me. I wanted to help you, but I didn't know how. So this conversation broke me more than anything else in the book. Because once again, you see that same burden of responsibility inside this family. Even the younger brother now feels guilty for not being able to contribute enough. He wants to help, he wants to save the family too.
Yeah. So he did not migrate for, how to say, kind of for his own egoistic objective.
Yeah.
Basically, he wants to save or help the family.
Yeah. And that call continues for a while, and Ibrahima manages to gather some details about where the brother might be in Libya. And then, just 4 days later, he begins the journey to find his brother. Remember, I said earlier that his father's death marked the beginning of Ibrahima's struggles, but this phone call is where the real story of little brother truly begins.
Yeah.
Because from that moment onward, the book descends into a chain of unimaginable ordeals, violence, exploitation, and survival that almost feels unreal. Except it isn't. So now I hope that listeners would see why I was hesitant to define just one or two themes for this episode, because this book carries so many of them at once.
Yep.
At the very beginning, there is the issue of healthcare, or more precisely, the lack of proper healthcare, which becomes one of the root causes of the entire cycle of suffering that follows for this family. Then comes education. Ibrahima drops out of school to help save the family and support his younger brother's future. But after that, that same younger brother ends up leaving school himself and leaving for Libya. And now, little by little, the story moves into the territory of migration. But even there, we need to be precise, because before this becomes a story about migration to Europe, it is first a story about trans-Saharan migration. And that dimension matters a lot, because when migration is discussed publicly, especially in Europe, it's about statistics, as Alpha mentioned in his contribution. And the focus is often only on the final destination, Europe.
Yep.
The boats crossing the Mediterranean, the borders, the asylum seekers, all of these debates. But what this book shows is that the real ordeal often begins much earlier within the African continent itself, across deserts, checkpoints, smugglers' routes, informal labor systems, armed groups, and entire underground economies built around human movement. Okay, so the first major ordeal Ibrahima faces is crossing northern Mali on his way to Algeria. And I think we need to pause briefly here to give a bit of context, because otherwise listeners might not fully grasp what this journey actually means. For many years now, northern Mali has been one of the epicenters of instability and armed conflict in the Sahel region. A lot of analysts trace this back, at least partly, to the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and especially the collapse of the Gaddafi regime in Libya. We'll come back to Libya, but the collapse of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, according to some analysts, destabilized the entire region and opened vast trafficking routes across the Sahara Desert beyond the effective control of governments. At the same time, there has also been a long-running Tuareg rebellion in northern Mali, with separatist groups seeking to split the country and create an independent state.
Yeah, actually, we touched on the dynamics of the region in our very first podcast episode about Terre Sainte of Senegalese author Mbugasa. So, our listeners, you can listen to the episode and get more context around northern Mali and what all of the instability and violent conflict means for people who live there.
Awesome. I'm not going to dive too deeply into the geopolitics here, but the important thing for listeners to understand is this. Ibrahima is not simply traveling through the desert. He is entering an active conflict zone, a territory shaped by armed groups, traffickers, warlords, smuggling routes, and extremely fragile state authority. So he pays transporters and starts moving north. First through Gao, a city some listeners may already know from the news, where there is still some level of government presence in Mali. Then further north to Kidal, much closer to the Algerian border. And even today, Kidal remains a highly unstable conflict area. We spoke about Kidal in our first episode,
Yeah.
as you just recalled.
Indeed. And there was even some recent news about Kidal, as the city got recaptured by the rebel groups who defeated the Malian army supported by former Wagner militia. So, yeah, I mean, it's still up to this day a very active conflict zone and still out of the control of the state.
Eventually, Ibrahima reaches a place referred to in the book as Talanda, which is a very nice sounding name
Yeah,
for
like
the
Wakanda.
kind of place it is. I believe the real place may actually be Talahandak, around 20 kilometers from the Algerian border. And this is where the story takes a horrifying turn, because Ibrahima arrives there thinking he's simply on the road to Algeria, but in reality, he has entered a prison. And here, there is another theme we could say emerges in the book, which is human trafficking. Because Talanda is essentially described as a giant prison run by armed groups where migrants are detained and forced to call the families to ask for ransom money. And the terrifying part is the only way out of this Talanda prison is either to pay or escape.
An escape is not very common. Most people pay
Try to pay or
or
die
die.
there,
I don't know.
or end up getting involved into the armed
Yeah.
conflict.
Yeah.
And I know this sounds almost fictional, like some kind of desert version of Prison Break.
Yeah.
Except that this is real, it's not a series. And according to many accounts, versions of this system still exist today across parts of the Sahara Desert. Eventually, Ibrahima manages to escape. And again, I'm skipping over details because the actual escape sequence is worth reading for yourself.
And I would add the escape scene is literally as if it was out of a Hollywood movie. Or worse, I would say a merciless episode of Game of Thrones.
No, Prison Break.
Or Prison Break.
But after escaping, he finds himself alone in the Sahara Desert. Barefoot, no water, no food, no shelter. And at some point, he meets a man on a motorbike who gives him water and points him towards Tiamiawin, which I believe is the first Algerian settlement after crossing from Mali. And from there begins another almost unimaginable stretch of suffering. Ibrahima walks barefoot through the Sahara Desert for 3 days. So to recap, 5 hours at first before meeting a biker who helped him get some water and find the right direction to Algeria. Then another 19 hours through the day walking. Then an entire day again under the sun. At one point, he removes his pants and wraps them around his head to protect himself from the heat. Eventually, even carrying the pants becomes too exhausting. So he throws them away and continues walking in his underwear. And while all of this is happening, remember, the Sahara Desert is not just an empty desert, because it's a very old desert. So there is life.
Yeah.
There are snakes, scorpions, even with the extreme temperatures. So extreme temperature, dangerous animals, complete isolation,
And
and
dangerous
yet,
people as well.
yeah,
I mean,
dangerous people. Yeah.
The armed groups are not too far away.
Yeah. But somehow this man survives and reaches Timiao in Algeria. And honestly, parts of this book are so extreme that if they appeared in a novel, some readers would probably say the author exaggerated. But this actually happened.
Yeah.
And
It seems that reality could be even more cruel than fiction.
yeah,
Sometimes.
Sigeliba Sachri Dia Tugudai Doba 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 Doba.
In Algeria, Ibrahima meets another character in the story, although there are not that many recurring people in the book, I would say.
Or characters, you mean, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
His name is Ismail, a 13-year-old Guinean boy who is also traveling along the migration routes. And after Ibrahima's crossing of the desert, after his feet had swollen from days of walking barefoot in the hot, sandy Sahara Desert, it is this young boy, Ismail, who massages his feet. And that's how the two connected. Together, they spent around 6 months in Timiaouin working in construction, then another 2 months in a city called Borj Mokhtar, again doing hard manual labor, mixing cement all day to make money. And actually, this is an important point that the book reveals again and again. Most migrants finance their journeys by working. They're not simply moving. They stop, work, save money, move again, work again, and continue like that for months or years. And maybe let me pause here for a moment again and offer a broader reflection. Because one thing this book challenged in me is the simplistic image many people have of migrants. The reality is that migrants are often extremely hard workers. In many countries across the world, they are the ones doing the difficult, exhausting, low status jobs that others no longer want to do. And some countries have found ways to integrate this labor in their economies in relatively structured ways, I would say. But there are also countries that decide to keep it largely informal, which ends up being damaging both for migrants and for the countries themselves. And honestly, I think much of North Africa falls into that second category. I remember speaking once with a friend who worked as a diplomat on African economic statistics in a North African country. And he told me something interesting. He said, if properly formalized, migrant labor could actually support parts of these economies in North Africa because the fact that migrants are already working informally in those countries itself is proof that there is demand for their labor. So, in other words, the need already exists. The real question is whether there is proper political willingness to regulate this activity with safeguards, legal protections, and control systems that could benefit both migrants and host countries instead of turning everything into exploitation. And of course, this would become politically very complicated because at the same time, many local populations themselves are struggling with unemployment. So, for politicians in those countries, formalizing migrant labor can easily become unpopular domestically. And then there is also the European Commission dimension that you already mentioned in the introduction, which is hovering in the background because for years the European Union broader objective has largely been to stop migration flows from before they reach Europe.
Yeah.
So the issue quickly becomes far bigger than just individual migrants. It becomes economic, political, geopolitical even.
Yeah. And as you said, I mean, I talked about this earlier, so I don't want to rant again about the European Union. But yeah, the European double standards here get me really triggered.
Anyway, after Borj Mukhtar, I believe Ibrahima and young Ismail tried their luck in another town for a while. The idea was eventually to reach Algiers, the capital city of Algeria, because wages were supposedly better in the larger cities. But before they leave, Ibrahima reveals to Ismail that, unlike most migrants around them, he is not actually trying to reach Europe. He's trying to get to Libya to find his little brother. And that is where the paths separate. Ismail continues along the migration route, and Ibrahima continues toward Libya. Now, crossing the Algeria-Libya border is itself another interesting sequence in the book, but I think I will spare our listeners some of the details here. What matters is the moment Ibrahima enters Libya, he immediately senses that this country is different. The atmosphere changes completely. People seem far more aggressive, more violent, more unpredictable. And one image from the book, I think, really captures that shift. His first sight in Libya is an old man heading to the Fajr prayer, so around 4 in the morning,
Yeah.
carrying a large gun over his shoulder.
Interesting. That's how he goes praying.
Yeah. And instantly, Ibrahima understands that he has entered another world.
Yeah.
Up until this point in the story, despite all the hardship he had endured, we spoke about desert crossing, the trafficking networks, the difficult labor. If I recall correctly, he had not really described suffering direct physical violence from other people. But Libya changes that almost instantly. So, one of his very first interactions in Libya was with a transporter who he had paid uh, to help him get toward the city where his brother was supposedly located. And that interaction doesn't end well because the transporter would end up striking him with a Kalashnikov so violently that it tears open the skin of his head.
Yeah. So there the violence starts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that moment, as you said, feels symbolic because from then onward, the level of violence in the story escalates dramatically. And I have to say this clearly, it's very difficult to do justice in a single podcast episode to what happens in Libya in this book. But I think we will do our best. And first, let's hear what Alpha thought about this Libyan sequence.
Then later in the book, there is a section that honestly shocked me the most: the imprisonment and forced labor in Libya. I think many people in Europe still don't fully understand what happened in these routes. We hear the word migrant and imagine movement, people traveling from one place to another. But in this book, movement turns into captivity. Migrants are detained, beaten, sold for labor, and dehumanized. Ibrahima described being trapped in this desert prison where people becomes commodity. And what hit me the hardest was how normal cruelty becomes in this system. Survival often depends on luck, on strangers, or whether someone decides to show mercy that day. But alongside the violence, Ibrahim displayed a constant longing for home. Throughout those chapters, he kept turning in his mind to his mother, to his village, to the ordinary life he left behind. There's a deep homesickness running through the story. You feel how desperate he wants to go back to his family, back to a place where people know his name and where he is more than just another body in a prison camp. What makes it even more tragic is that going home is no longer a simple option. By that point, Ibrahima has already crossed the desert, survived imprisonment, and lost so much there is no clear path back. He is trapped not only physically, but also emotionally. The farther he travels, the more he misses home, yet the less possible it becomes to return. He is caught between the past he cannot get back to and the future he never originally intended to pursue. Reading those chapters as someone from West Africa was emotionally difficult because people in this story felt familiar to me. The village, the family structure, the hope people carries, it all felt close to home. As someone who grew up in a village in Guinea-Bissau, who was raised by my grandmother after my parents left for Europe, I recognize that attachment to home and family is important. I also understood why memories of his mother could sustain him even in the darkest moment. That's what makes this book so powerful. It destroys the illusion that there are two completely separate worlds, us and them. The distance between safety and suffering can be incredibly small. Sometimes it's just being born into a different moment, a different opportunity, or having parents who managed to leave before the road to Europe became desperate. And despite everything, the prison camp, the violence, and the grief, the book still contains humanity. The migrants share food, they protect each other, they help strangers survive. Those moments become even more meaningful because they exist in a place designed to strip people of their dignity and their humanity. That balance is what makes the story feel honest. It never turns migrants into saints, but it also refuses to strip them of their humanity. For me, Minya, or Little Brother in English, is not just a story about migration. It's a story about family, responsibility, loss, and survival. It's a story that gives voice to those who have none the moment they embark on the migration route. I think that's what makes this book so important, and that's why the book stayed with me longer after I finished it.
I want to mention that in the Libyan city of Sabrata, so the city where his brother was supposedly located, Ibrahima lands in a migrant camp called Tranquilo.
And the name itself is a huge absurdity. Like, tranquilo stems from tranquility, but it was nothing like it, actually.
Yeah, and this camp is linked to what migrants refer to as the European program, quote unquote. What that really means is the Mediterranean crossing toward Europe. The camp is run by a man called Baba Hassan, and apparently he has many of them, the camps. So Baba Hassan is some kind of chief migrant trafficker.
CMT.
Someone sitting at the center of this underground system, organizing departures, controlling migrants, and profiting from the desperation. And what the book slowly reveals is that by this point, migration is no longer simply about movements from one country to another, as Alpha referred to. It's an entire economy, an ecosystem with camps, intermediaries, armed groups, transporters, prisons, ransoms, and people making money at every stage of human suffering.
Yeah. And when you say money, that requires payment systems as well, right? Especially that many of the traffickers ask people they capture to ask their families back in their countries for money. So actually, this got me wondering, how do they get the money actually? And basically, that means that there is some kind of transnational payment system which allows the families to send the money to the traffickers. I don't think they do it through kind of ordinary bank transfer, and there must be kind of some parallel
There are
banking
always
system.
middlemen.
Yeah.
Someone who can receive it, and perhaps someone from West Africa also working with the Libyan to get.
So it's like the whole system basically is connected.
It's an economy, as I said.
Yeah.
And honestly, just so listeners can grasp the level of violence and fear that define this place, I want to read a short passage from the book. Or Haja, do you want to read it for us?
Okay. I spent 2 days in Sabrata. And there, 2 days feel very long. Even longer than 2 days in the desert without water. Because you can't get anywhere. You walk, you stop, you look. You walk to the next street. You run. You hide. You look again. You don't see anything moving. You come out of hiding. You go on. Stop. Another street corner. You scan. No one. They are all invisible. But you know they're there. You hear gunshots. But you don't know where they are coming from.
So after learning that Baba Hassan controlled several camps across western Libya, Ibrahima decides to continue searching for his brother elsewhere. He hears that there are similar camps in another Libyan city called Zawiya. Now, traveling there during the day is not really an option because migrants are constantly hunted by both traffickers and authorities. And as we mentioned earlier, one of the broader objectives behind these systems is precisely to contain migrants within North Africa. So Ibrahima decides to make the journey on foot at night. And in the book, the walk is supposed to take only a day. But eventually, he is captured by two civilian traffickers that take him to a place where other migrants are already being held captive and force him to call his family once again to ask for ransom money. Except, for poor Ibrahima, there is nobody he can call and who can actually pay the ransom money that they were asking for. And this is where the book enters some of its darkest territory because what follows is torture, real torture. The details are so painful that I'm going to spare listeners most of them here. Eventually, Ibrahima is sold to an old man who keeps him in a hangar full of chickens. And when I say chickens, I literally mean with chickens. His job is to feed them, but also to live among them. He eats there, sleeps there, spends his days and nights surrounded by them. Every evening, the old man visits him and locks him inside the hangar like an animal with the animals. Until one night, the old man receives an emergency phone call and, in the rush, forgets to lock the door. And that tiny mistake becomes Ibrahima's chance to escape. So once again, he runs, he eventually reaches Zawiya and continues searching for his little brother, but he finds nothing, no trace of him. And so after all of this, he returns back to Sabrata, the first city he arrived in after entering Libya. Now, the story is much longer and much more detailed than what I'm summarizing here, but eventually, back in Sabrata, another Guinean migrant, someone who had known his brother, finally gathers the courage to tell Ibrahima what may have happened to Al Hassan. So he said to him that his brother had boarded one of the inflatable boats attempting the Mediterranean crossing to Europe, and the boat suffered a naufrage.
So yeah, naufrage is a French word, but it means shipwreck.
Yes.
So basically the boat sank.
And it sank with 114 people, and Ibrahima's brother was probably one of them. The migrants refer to the inflatable boats as the Zodiac. I actually Googled the term afterward and realized it originally comes from a brand name for inflatable rubber boats.
Interesting.
But of course, Zodiac also immediately evokes astrology, right? Fate, luck, destiny. I found that coincidence strange, and this is where sometimes, this book almost feels like a novel.
Yeah. Kind of quote unquote poetic
Yeah.
in a sense. But as you said, it's just the reality.
It's
just
the
a coincidence.
reality, yeah. Now, back to the story. At first, when this was announced to Ibrahima, he could not even believe it. He struggles to understand how one of those tiny inflatable boats, those zodiacs, could possibly carry 144 people. But slowly, painfully, the realization begins to settle in. His brother is probably gone and forever. That realization is so devastating because by this point in the story, you fully understand how deeply Ibrahima loved his brother. Everything he endured, the desert, the prisons, the torture, the hunger, the violence, all of them, he accepted all of it because he believed he could still find him, still save his brother. But it was already too late. And after learning this, Ibrahima cannot simply turn around and go home. By then, the journey itself has trapped him too, I would say. His story continues. He goes back to Algeria, eventually makes it to Morocco, and after many more hardships, too many more hardships that we cannot cover in one episode, he finally reaches the Basque country
In Spain.
in Spain. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ironically, he also reaches Europe on a zodiac. And just like his brothers, that boat almost sinks. The difference is that this time the rescue team arrives in time. Ibrahima gets the chance his brother never had. And there you have it. This was Ibrahima's story, or at least part of it. Because honestly, no summary can fully capture the emotional weight of this book. Anything you want to add?
Not really. I think we need to let the story sink in with our listeners. This book, although relatively small, has been the heaviest we covered in our podcast so far. And so we close our journey through Little Brother, a refugee's odyssey through the horrors of the trans-Saharan and trans-Mediterranean crossing, and a story about African family values, duty, and brotherly love. If this story sparked something in you, pass it on, just like oral tradition. You've been listening to Threads of Ifriqiya with Ramdan and Hajar. A biento, and stay curious.